The Gormenghast Trilogy by MERVYN PEAKE. Book 1. TITUS GROAN. Blood at Midnight, Part 2. Without losing a moment, he scrambled over 3 fallen beams, his long limbs jerking out fantastically as he did so, and turned when he had reached the centre of the room to discover that the door he had entered by was already filled with his enemy. So intent had they been on their game of wits and death that it had not occurred to them to wonder how it was that they were able to see one another in what was normally a lightless hall. They found no time for surprise. They did not even realize that the fury had died out of the storm and that the only sound was a heavy, lugubrious droning. A third of the sky was clear of cloud, and in this third was the hump-backed moon, very close and very white. Its radiance poured through the open wall at the far end of the Hall of Spiders. Beyond the opening, it danced and glittered on the hissing water that had formed great walled-in lakes among the roofs. The rain slanted its silver threads and raised spurts of quicksilver on striking water. The hall itself had the effect of a drawing in black dove grey and silver ink. It had long been derelict. Fallen and half-fallen beams were leaning or lying at all angles, and between these beams, joining one to another, hanging from the ceiling of the floor above, for most of the immediate welkin had fallen in, spreading in every direction, taut or sagging, plunged in black shadow, glimmering in half-light, or flaming exquisitely with a kind of filigree and leprous brilliance where the moon fell unopposed upon them. The innumerable webs of the spiders filled the air. Flay had broken through a liana of shadowy webs, and now, in the centre of the room, watching the cook in the doorway, he clawed away the misty threads from his eyes and mouth with his left hand. Even in those areas of the hall where the moonbeams could not penetrate and where great glooms brooded, the darkness was intersected here and there by glittering strands that seemed to shift their position momentarily. The slightest deflection of the head drew forth against the darkness a new phenomenon of glittering twine, detached from its web, disarticulated, miraculous, and transient. What eyes had they for such ephemera? Those webs to them were screens to aid or hinder, to snare with, or be snared by. These were the features of death's battleground. Swelter's shadowy, moonless body at the door was intersected by the brilliant radii and jerking perimeters of a web that hung about halfway between himself and Mr. Flay. The centre of the web coincided with his left nipple. The spatial depths between the glittering threads of the web and the chef seemed abysmic and prodigious. He might have belonged to another realm. The Hall of Spiders yawned and shrank, the threads deceiving the eye, the distances shifting, surging forward or crumbling away to the illusory deflectings of the moon. Swelter did not stay by the door longer than it took him to gain a general impression of the kind of hovel in which the thin man chose to protect his long bones. Seeping with malice, yet the chef was not inclined to underrate the guile of his antagonist. He had been lured here for some reason. The arena had not been of his choosing. He swivelled his eyes to left and right, his cleaver poised before him. He noted the encumbrances, the haphazard beams, dusty and half-decayed, and the omnipresent awnings of the spiders. He could not see why these should be more to his advantage than to the man he intended to sever. Flay had never had a concrete reason for his choice of the Hall of Spiders. Perhaps it was because he imagined that he would prove more agile among the webs and beams, but this he now doubted, having found how swiftly the chef had followed him. But that he had fulfilled his intention of inveigling his enemy to the place of his own choosing must surely infer that the initiative once again lay with him. He felt himself to be a thought ahead of the cook. He held the long sword ahead of him as he watched the great creature approach. Swelter was sweeping aside the webs that impeded him with his cleaver, keeping his eyes upon Mr. Flay and shifting his head on his neck from side to side in order to improve his view. He came to a halt, and with his eyes perpetually fixed on Mr. Flay, began to drag away the clinging cobwebs from the blade and handle of his weapon. He came forward again, sweeping the cleaver in great arcs before him and treading gingerly over the slanting timbers, and then seemed about to halt once more in order to repeat the unwebbing process when, with an obvious change of purpose, he moved forward as though no obstacles were in his path. He seemed to have decided that to be continually reconditioning himself and his weapon during the blood encounter was ill-advised and untimely, not to say an insult to the occasion. As pirates in the hot brine shallows wading make, face to face, their coma-hindered lunges, sun-blind, fly-agonized, and browed with pearls, so here the timbers leaned, moonlight misled and the rank webs impeded. It was necessary to ignore them as they tickled the face and fastened themselves about the mouth and eyes, to realize that although between the sword and the hand and the elbow and the body, the silvery threads hung like tropical festoons, and although the naked steel was as though delivered in its call, that the limbs were free to move, as free as ever before. The speed of the swung cleaver would in no way be retarded. The secret was to ignore. So Swelter moved forward, growing at each soft, deft pace more and more like something from the deeps, where the grey twine-weed coils the sidling sea-cow. Suddenly stepping into a shaft of moonlight, he flamed in a network of threads. He peered through a shimmering mesh. He was gossamer. He concentrated his entire sentience on the killing. He banished all irrelevancies from his canalized mind. His great ham of a face was tickling as though a swarm with insects, but there was no room left in his brain to receive the messages which his nerve endings were presumably delivering. His brain was full. It was full of death. Flay watched every step. His long back was inclined forwards like the bole of a sloping conifer. His head was lowered as though he was about to use it as a battering ram. His padded knees were slightly bent. The yards of cloth were now redundant, but there was no opportunity for him to unwind them. The cook was within 7 feet of him. Between them lay a fallen beam. About 2 yards to Swelter's left, its extremity had settled into the dust, but to the right, the relic of an old iron box supporting it roughly at its centre, it terminated about 3 feet up in the air, spilthed with fly-choked webs. It was towards the support of this beam that Swelter made his way, beating the filigreed moonlight to his knees where it sagged and fled. His path could be traced. He had left behind him from the door to where he stood the web-walled canyon of a dream. Standing now, immediately behind the broken box, he had narrowed the distance between them to just over the measure of his arm and cleaver. The air between them was a little clearer. They were closer now than they had ever been this raining night. That dreadful, palpable closeness that can only be felt when there is mutual hatred. Their separate and immediate purposes were identical. What else had they in common? Nothing but the spiders all about them, the webs, the beams, the byplay of the spangling moon, and the drumming of the rain in their ears. At any other time the chef would have made play with his superior wit. He would have taunted the long, half-crouching figure before him. But now, with blood to be spilt, what did it matter whether or not he incensed his foe? His wit would fall in a more concrete way. It would flash, but in steel, and let his final insult be that Flay could no longer tell an insult from a lamb chop, unless with his body in 2 pieces he were still able to differentiate. For a moment they stood, moving a little up and down on their toes. With his sword before him, Mr. Flay began to move along his side of the fallen beam to the left, in order presumably to come to closer grips. As Swelter moved his little eyes to the right, following every movement of the other's body, he found that his vision was being impeded by so heavy an interfusion of ancient webbing that it would be unwise for him to remain where he was. In a flash, he had both taken a sideways pace to his left and switched his eyes in the same direction. Flay at once crept in upon him, his face half shrouded by the thick webs through which he peered. His head was immediately above the lower end of the beam. Swelter's rapid glance to his left had been fruitful. He had seen the lifted end of the beam as his first true friend in a hall of hindrances, and when his eyes returned to his thin foe, his fat lips twisted. Whether such a muscular obscenity could be termed a smile, he neither knew nor cared. Mr. Flay was crouching exactly where he had hoped that he might lure him. His chin was characteristically jutting forwards, as though this habit had been formed for Mr. Swelter's convenience alone. There was no time to lose. Mr. Swelter was 3 feet from the raised terminal of the long beam when he sprang. For a moment there was so much flesh and blood in the air that a star changed colour under Saturn's shoulder. He did not land on his feet. He had not intended to. To bring the entire weight of his body down upon the beam head was all that mattered. He brought it down, and as his underbelly struck, the far end of the beam leapt like a living thing, and, striking Mr. Flay beneath his outstretched jaw, lifted him to his full height before he collapsed, a dead weight, to the floor. The chef, heaving himself grotesquely to his feet, could hardly get to the body of his victim quickly enough. There he lay, his coat rucked up at the level of his armpits, his lean flank exposed. Mr. Swelter raised the cleaver. He had waited so long for this. Many, many months. He turned his eyes to the web-shrouded weapon in his hands, and as he did so, Mr. Flay's left eyelid fluttered, and a moment later he had focused the chef and was watching him through his lashes. He had not the strength to move at that horrifying moment. He could only watch. The cleaver was lifted, but he now saw that Swelter was peering quizzically at the blade, his eyebrows raised. And then he heard the sponge-like voice for the second time that night.
"Would you like to be wiped, my pretty one?"
it said, as though certain that a reply would be forthcoming from the brutal head of steel.
"You would, wouldn't you? Before you have your supper? Of course. And how could you ever enjoy a nice warm bath with all your clothes on, eh? But I'll soon be washing you, little Blossom, and I must wipe your face, dear. Wipe it blue as ink. Then you can start drinking, can't you?"
He held the lean metal head at his bosom.
"It's just the thing for thirsty ones, my darling. Just the very nightcap."
There followed a few moments of low, gastric chuckling before he began to drag the webbing from the cleaver's blade. He was standing about 2 feet away from the prostrate figure of Flay, who was half in and half out of moonlight. The demarcation line lay across his bare flank. Luckily for him, it was his upper half that was in shadow, and his head was all but lost. As he watched the overhang above him and noted that the chef had all but cleared the blade of cobwebs, his attention became focused upon the upper segment of the face of his foe. It was veiled, as indeed was the rest of the face and body, with the ubiquitous webs, but it seemed that above the left ear there was something additional. So accustomed had Swelter become to the tickling of the webs across his face and to the 100 minor irritations of the skin that he had not noticed that upon his right eye there sat a spider. So thickly had his head been draped that he had accepted the impediment to his vision as being part of the general nuisance. Flay could see the spider quite clearly from where he lay, but what he now saw was something fateful. It was the spider's mate. She had emerged from the grey muddle above the left ear and was taking, leg by leg, the long, thin paces. Was she in search of her husband? If so, her sense of direction was sound, for she made towards him. Swelter was running the flat of his hand along the steel face of his weapon. It was naked for use. Putting his blubber lips to the moonlit steel, he kissed it, and then, falling a short step back, he lifted the cleaver with both hands, grasping the long handle high above his lowered head. He stood upon tiptoe and, poised for a moment thus, went suddenly blind. His left eye had become involved with a female spider. She sat upon it squarely, enjoying the rolling movement of the orb she covered. It was for this precise instant that Flay had been waiting ever since he had caught sight of the insect a few seconds previously. It seemed that he had lain there stretched vulnerably beneath the murderous cleaver for an hour at least. Now was his moment, and gripping his sword which had fallen beside him when he fell, he rolled himself with great rapidity from beneath the belly of the cook and from the cleaver's range. Swelter, sweating with irritation at being balked for the second time in this business of climax, imagined, nevertheless, that Flay was still below him. Had he struck downwards in spite of the spiders on his eyes, it might be that Flay could not have escaped, but Mr. Swelter would have considered it a very sorry ending after all his pains to find he had made slaughter without having been able to see the effect. Outside Lord Sepulchre's door it was different. There was no light anyway. But here, with a beautiful moon to illumine the work, it was surely neither the time nor the place to be at the mercy of a spider's whim. And so he lowered the cleaver to his bosom, and, freeing his right hand, plucked the insect from his eyes, and he had started to raise the weapon again before he saw that his victim had gone. He wheeled about, and as he did so, he experienced a white-hot pain in his left buttock and a searing sensation at the side of his head. Screaming like a pig, he wheeled about, raising a finger to where his ear should have been. It had gone. Flay had swiped it off, and it swung to and fro in a spider-made hammock a foot above the floorboards at the far end of the room. And what voluptuary ever lolled with half the languor of that boneless thing? A moonbeam, falling on the raddled lobe, withdrew itself discreetly, and the ear disappeared into tactful darkness. Flay had, in rapid succession, jabbed and struck. The second blow had missed the skull, but he had drawn the first blood. In fact, first and second, for Swelter's left rump bled magnificently. There was, in point of fact, an island growing gradually, a red island that had seeped through to the white vastness of his cloth rear. This island was changing its contours momentarily, but as the echo of Swelter's scream subsided, it very much resembled in its main outline the inverted wing of an angel. The blows had no more than gored him. Of Swelter's acreage, only a perch or two here and there might, if broken, prove vulnerable loam. That he bled profusely could prove little. There was blood in him to revitalize an anemic army, with enough left over to cool the guns. Placed end to end, his blood vessels might have coiled up to the Tower of Flints, and halfway down again like a Virginia creeper, a vampire's home from home. Be that as it may, he was bloodied, and the cold, calculating malice had given way to a convulsive hatred that had no relation to the past. It was on the boil of now, and heading into the webs that divided them, he let loose a long, scything blow at Mr. Flay. He had moved very rapidly, and but for the fact that the moonlit webs deceived him as to the distance between them, so that he struck too soon, it is probable that all would have been over bar the disposal of the body. As it was, the wind of the blow and the hiss of the steel were enough to lift the hairs on Mr. Flay's head, and to set up a horrible vibration in his ears. Recovering almost at once from the surprise, however, Flay struck in return at the cook, who was for a moment off his balance, catching him across the bolster-like swelling of his shoulder. And then things happened very rapidly, as though all that had gone before was a mere preamble. Recovering from the flounder of his abortive blow, and with the fresh pain at his shoulder, Swelter, knowing he had, with his cleaver extended, the longer reach, gripped the weapon at the extreme end of the handle and began to gyrate, his feet moving with horrifying rapidity beneath his belly, not only with the kind of complicated dance movement which swivels the body around and around at great speed, but in a manner which brought him nearer every moment to Mr. Flay. Meanwhile, his cleaver, outstretched before him, sang on its circular path. What remained of the webs in the centre of the room fell away before this gross, moon-dappled cyclone. Flay, nonplussed for the moment, watched in fascinated horror the rapid succession of faces which the swivelling of Swelter conducted, faces of which he had hundreds, appearing and reappearing at high speed, with an equal number of rear views of the huge head, interlarded in all literalness. The whir of steel was approaching rapidly. The rotation was too speedy for him to strike between the cycles, nor was his reach long enough were he to stand his ground. Moving backwards, he found that he was being forced gradually into a corner at the far end of the room. Swelter was bearing down on him with a kind of nightmare quality. His mind was working, but the physical perfection of his footwork and the revolving of the steel had something of the trance about them, something that had become through their very perfection detached and on their own. It was difficult to imagine how the great white top could stop itself. And then Flay had an idea. As though cowering from the oncoming steel, he moved back further and further into the corner until his bent backbone came into contact with the junction of the two walls. Cornered of his own choosing, for he would have had time to leap from the rain-filled opening of moonlight had he wished, he raised himself to his full height, prizing his spine into the right angle of the walls, his sword lowered to his feet, and waited. The scything cleaver spun nearer momentarily. At every glimpse of the chef's rotating head he could see the little bloodshot eyes focused upon him. They were like lumps of loathing. So concentrated was his every thought and fibre upon the death of Flay that, as he whirred closer and closer, his normal wits were in abeyance. And what Flay had hoped for happened. The arc of the long weapon was of such amplitude that at its left and right extremes it became all of a sudden within a few inches of the adjacent walls, and at the next revolution had nicked away the plaster before finally, as the walls, so it seemed to Swelter, leapt forward to meet him, the chef discovered the palms of his hands and forearms stinging with the shock of having taken a great section of the mouldering wall away. Flay, with his sword still held along his leg, its point beside his toe-cap, was in no position to receive the impact of Swelter's body as it fell forward upon him. So sudden and so jarring had been the stoppage of his murderous spinning that, like a broken engine, its rhythm and motivation lost, its body out of control, Swelter collapsed, as it were, within his own skin as he slumped forwards. If Flay had not been so thin and had not forced himself so far into the corner, he would have been asphyxiated. As it was, the clammy, web-bedraggled pressure of Swelter's garments over his face forced him to take short, painful breaths. He could do nothing, his arms pinned at his sides, his visage crushed. But the effects of the shock were passing, and Swelter, as though suddenly regaining his memory, heaved himself partially from the corner in a tipsy way, and although Mr. Flay, at such close range, was unable to use his sword, he edged rapidly along the left-hand wall, and, turning, was within an ace of darting a thrust at Swelter's ribs, when his foe staggered out of range in a series of great drunken curves. The giddiness with which his gyrations had filled him were for the moment standing him in good stead, for reeling as he did about the Hall of Spiders, he was an impossible target for all but mere bloodletting. And so Flay waited. He was acutely aware of a sickening pain at the back of his neck. It had grown as the immediate shock of the blow to his jaw had subsided. He longed desperately for all to be over. A terrible fatigue had entered him. Swelter, once the room no longer span around him and his sense of balance was restored, moved with horrible purpose across the hall, the cleaver trembling with frustration in his hand. The sound of his feet on the boards was quite distinct, and startled Flay into glancing over his shoulder into the moonlight. The rain had ceased, and, save for the dolorous whispering of Gormenghast adrip, there was a great hush. Flay had felt all of a sudden that there could be no finality, no decision, no death blow in the Hall of Spiders. Save for this conviction, he would have attacked Swelter as he leaned, recovering from his giddiness, by the door at the far end of the room. But he only stood by the moon-filled opening, a gaunt silhouette, the great cloth rolls like malformations at his knees, and waited for the chef's advance, while he worked at the vertebrae of his aching neck with his long, bony fingers. And then had come the onrush. Swelter was upon him, his cleaver raised, the left side of his head and his left shoulder shiny with blood, and a trail of it behind him as he came. Immediately before the opening to the outer air was a 6-inch step upwards, which terminated the flooring. Beyond this, there was normally a 3-foot drop to a rectangular walled-in area of roof. Tonight there was no such drop, for a great lake of rainwater lapped at the dusty boards of the hall. To a stranger, the lake gave the appearance of profound depth as it basked in the moon. Flay, stepping backwards over the raised strip of boarding, sent up a fountain of lemon-yellow spray as his foot descended. In a moment he was spidering his legs backwards through water as warm as tea. The air, for all the downpour, was as oppressive as ever. The horrible weight of heat was undispersed. And then the horror happened. Swelter, following at high speed, had caught his toe at the raised lip of the opening, and, unable to check his momentum, had avalanched himself into the warm water. The cleaver sailed from his grasp, and circling in the moonlight, fell within a fluke of flame in the far golden silence of the lake. As Swelter, face down and floundering like a sea monster, struggled to find his feet, Flay reached him. As he did so, with a primeval effort, the cook, twisting his trunk about, found, and then lost again, a temporary foothold, and writhing, fell back again, this time upon his back, where he floated, lashing, great washes of water spreading on all sides to the furthermost reaches. For a moment he was unable to breathe, but whether this advantage was outbalanced by his having to see, towering above him, the dark, unpreaching body of his foe, with the hilt of the sword raised high over his head, both hands grasping it, and the point directed at the base of his ribs, only he could know. The water about him was reddening, and his eyes, like marbles of gristle, rolled in the moonlight as the sword plunged deeply. Flay did not trouble to withdraw it. It remained like a mast of steel whose sails had fallen to the decks, where, as though with a life of their own, unconnected with wind or tide, They leapt and shook in ghastly turbulence. At the masthead, the circular sword hilt, like a crow's nest, boasted no inch-high pirate. Flay, leaning against the outer wall of the Hall of Spiders, the water up to his knees and watching with his eyes half closed the last death throes, heard a sound above him, and in a shudder of gooseflesh turned his eyes and found them staring into a face that smiled in silver light from the depths of the hall beyond. Its eyes were circular, and its mouth was opening, and as the lunar silence came down as though forever in a vast white sheet, the long-drawn screech of a death owl tore it, as though it had been calico, from end to end.